So in this presentation, we'll talk about scripting. And in order to get set up for this next phase of the project, if I go into the lesson folder and I download the Island scripts folder, the GUI graphics, and both of these coin models, we'll use these assets to kind of play with some of the different functionality inside Unity. So if I were to click on the island.zip, I'm using Chrome as my browser, so I'll get a little notification that I've downloaded it here. And if I just, in my case, if I show it in the Finder, and then I can drag it to the desktop, or I can double click from here, unzip it, and take that folder and drag it to the desktop. So I've already done that, and I'll just jump out and minimize a couple of these windows here. And you can see here that I have the Island scripts folder unzipped and ready to be incorporated into my project. So if I go back to Unity, if I select my asset folder, I can actually just drag this folder directly into the project tab. And so now I have my Island scripts folder. It's nice and organized. And I'll double click, and inside this we have a series of scripts. And for the sake of this presentation, we'll focus on the rotate script. Now, the rotate script is a big JS icon, and that lets me know that this is a JavaScript document, or a flavor of JavaScript that Unity likes to use. And if you haven't done any kind of coding or programming before, that's okay. Don't be terrified about this part of it, because we'll just take a look at some of these scripts, how to implement them, and how to tweak some of the values to get what you want out of this, out of each script. With the rotate script selected, if I click on it one time and I look over here in the inspector, you can see that it gives me a preview of what the contents of that script is. And in this case, this is a really simple script. It's just got a couple lines of code. If I double click on this script, you can see that it'll pop open in an application called MonoDevelop, okay, which comes bundled with Unity. So you have that inside your application folder, inside your Unity folder. You'll have MonoDevelop, and it should be linked automatically already, that if you double click on one of these files, it'll open up in MonoDevelop. Now, if you double click on this file and it opens up in, say, Dreamweaver or some kind of other text editor, and you want to use MonoDevelop, which I recommend, you may have to go back and select the file association. And you can do that by going into the Unity preferences and choose external tools and make sure that the external script editor is set to MonoDevelop. And you may have to browse for it and dig into your application folder, look inside Unity and find that MonoDevelop application. But that's in the unusual circumstance that you're using another app, by default you're using another application. You can change that here. You can also see in here in the preference that you can associate an image editing application with images inside Unity. So I've set mine to Photoshop. So if I have a Photoshop document or a PNG or a JPEG and I want to modify that in some way, I can just double click right in Unity and it'll launch inside Photoshop. But back to scripting. If I double click on rotate, the rotate script, it'll open up in this application MonoDevelop. And MonoDevelop is kind of a nice environment to develop scripts, and we can work back and forth between Unity and MonoDevelop. In fact, I'll keep this open, and if I make a change to this script, all I have to do is save it, and Unity will continue to leverage that script. Now, I've created a cube. Oops, let's see if I can select it. There we go. I'm going to make sure that the move tool is selected so I can see my axes here. I created a cube, and I've set this in the environment where it's pretty close to my first-person controller, so when I hit the play button, I don't have to run halfway around the island to find this cube. So I've made sure that it's close to my spawn point, and I have it floating up in the air for now, just for the sake of the demo, to understand how to incorporate this script into my project. Scripts will allow us to interact with our environment, to control certain events and variables, and allow us to interact with our environment in a much more meaningful way. In the case of this rotate script, what I want to do is I want to apply this rotate script to this cube. And once I do, we'll take a look at it. Now I have two cubes here, and maybe I'll call this cube rotate test. It's a temporary cube to test our rotation. This other cube was just the reference that I introduced a long time ago, early on in the presentation, to talk a little bit about scale. So I'm going to delete that because I know I don't want that there, and it cleans up my hierarchy. With this cube rotate test selected, what I can do is I can take this rotate script and drag and drop, and either drop it directly on the asset in the hierarchy view, or drag that script into the inspector in which case it'll add this script as a component to that object. Now, the minute that I drag the script onto the object one way or the other, you can see that I have this rotate script that's been attached. It tells me that it's a script and that the title of that rotate script is here. Now, I could double click on this file and it'll open up directly into MonoDevelop. And looking at this script, what this script does is it has this function, and the function runs in the update. And what update means is that every time the frame is redrawn, or every time the frame updates, it executes whatever kind of code is inside that script. And so depending on your computer, the speed of your computer, when I hit the play button, we're running this simulation at a specific frame rate. You can see already that my object is rotating. Now, this is being refreshed at a certain frame rate. Mine might be refreshed faster or slower than yours, depending on which kind of computer you have and what your graphics card is capable of. But rest assured, it's pretty fast. Look and see what this script is doing. Obviously, we saw it rotating our object, but if I jump back into MonoDevelop, what I'm seeing is there's reference to a transform dot rotate. And if I go back into Unity and I look at the object itself, you'll notice that there's a transform component, and that transform component has a rotate value. Parameters which govern the rotation. And you can see that there's three values here. There's X, Y, and Z. And if I zoom in a little bit on this object, and if I want to see what the rotation of the X is, I can scrub that number back and forth, and I can see that it's rotating along its X axis. Or in other words, if we take a skewer and we run it through our cube, that red axis will be the Y axis, which it rotates around. So I'll just set that back to 0. If I rotate around the Y, it's rotating around the Y axis, and so on for the Z. So if I take a closer look at this script, and I see that it's a function update, so every time the screen updates, it's running a transform.rotate. The first value is set to 100. Let me zero out that value for a minute. I'll just set it to 0. It's a 0, 100. And it says a little bit about times delta time, and we'll skip that for a minute, but just rest assured, or just know that there's a value, comma, followed by another value, comma, followed by another value. So there's a 3-value string here. And if I look at my object, it's the value of X, Y, and Z. Currently now, when I hit the play button, this object should be rotating along the Y value. Okay, it looks like it's rotating along a couple different values here. So maybe I didn't save my script. So I'll jump back into MonoDevelop. I'll actually just take this bit and I'll cut it, Command X, out of the equation, and I'll type in 0. So currently it's saying transform.rotate 0, 0, 0. I'll save that, and because I've saved that, I should be able to play, and that object should no longer be rotating. And in fact, it's still. I'll unpause it. If I jump back into MonoDevelop, this is the X value, this is the Y value, and if I just change that from 0 to 10, and I'll hit save, and now I hit play, that object should be rotating around its Y value, which it is in this case. Okay, and it's rotating pretty fast. And so I can go back in and I can change that rotation value, and I can take that down to, let's say we'll take it down to 5. Okay, and I'll save and I'll hit play, and I'll see what that rate of rotation is. Now, because this object is rotating according to the frame update, or it's running in the update function, this cube may spin faster or slower on my computer than it does on your computer, because our frame rates might be different depending on the hardware, how new our computer is, how efficient it is at running the software. And if you notice that line of code that I cut out for a moment, I'll just take that value of 5 and I'll replace it with the line of code that I cut out. What that says is it's 100 times time.delta time. And it's not so important how to write that line of code right now, but what that means is take an absolute value and multiply it by real time. And what real time does is it makes it frame rate independent. So in other words, this bit of code here unifies the rotation so that it's updating based on a real-time measurement rather than running based on how fast your computer can update its screen. So when I hit play, if I look at this, that value that it's now rotating should be the same and consistent speed that it runs on any computer. And that's an important notion, and we're going to see that line of code pop up from time to time. When we see time.delta time, it means that the measurement of time should be in delta time, which means according to Unity, that's real time, or it uses the computer clock, the internal time, to measure how fast something happens. So we'll see that over and over again. So I'll just go back to my cube object, my cube rotate test here. If I want to temporarily disable a script that's attached to an object, I can just uncheck the script component. So that script is still attached to the object, but it's deactivated. And so now when I hit the play button, I look at the script, nothing is happening. If I toggle that script back on, it will continue to rotate. If I permanently want to remove that component, I can always go into the little cog here that's associated with that component and just choose to remove that component. That script is no longer attached to the object. If I want to reattach it, I have two options. I can drag rotate and just drop it right here inside the inspector panel with that cube selected, or I can drag and drop directly onto the object itself and it'll inherit that script the same way. So that's just a basic overview of implementing scripts inside Unity. We'll take a more meaningful approach to scripts here in just a short bit and start to add some interactivity to our island scene. And the scenario that we'll build is that we'll have some objects around our island that we can go pick up and collect. Not only can we collect them, but we can keep track of either how many objects we've collected or what the value of the objects are that we've collected. We can apply this same concept to something like health, to where if we run into something, some bad stuff, we can take some damage, and if we run into some good stuff, we can collect it and earn some health or some points for it. But we'll talk about those in future presentations. But for now, make sure that you get a handle on applying scripts and modifying the basic components. Make sure that you become familiar with both the Unity interface at this point with regard to scripting, and then launching a script inside MonoDevelop and modifying some of the basic parameters of a script. And my final thought here with regard to the introduction to scripting is that scripts can be very sensitive. They're very strict in terms of the way that they're written. In fact, we're using JavaScript, which is the most forgiving language probably inside Unity. Unity supports multiple languages, including C#, JavaScript. So if you've done any kind of programming before, these are just different flavors of programming. And Unity has its own proprietary version. It calls JavaScript, which is very JavaScript-esque, but is a little bit different. It has some proprietary functionality to it. And but something as simple as leaving out a punctuation. So in this case, I'll just remove that comma. If I save this and I have that script implemented on this object, when I hit play, I may get a compiler error. And Unity will do a pretty good job of telling me that it's what script is getting the error and possibly which line of code it's getting. And it might even give you a brief definition saying it expected to see one thing and it found another. But in some cases, it just says, okay, the rotate script is giving you an error. It might be on line 3. So let's take a look at line 3 of our rotate script. And in fact, on line 3, I don't have an XYZ value. I just have an X and a Y value, and it was expecting a Z value. So the minute I throw in that comma to delineate that, everything should be good. Additionally, at the end of most thoughts or most lines of code, there's either going to be a bracket or a curly bracket, or in some cases there's also going to be a semicolon which ends a line. And if that semicolon is missing in this case, and I try to run my script, even though all the logic is there, missing some of that punctuation causes that script to error. So I'll just update it, I'll save it, and now when I go back into Unity, everything should function as is intended. So make sure that you familiarize yourselves with the Unity script interface and MonoDevelop, And we'll catch up in the next presentation and talk about implementing slightly more complicated scripts to really ramp up the interaction that we can have with our island. But we'll do that in the next presentation.